This is the last week of lectures, and we'll finish up with a discussion of adaptive management. Before I get into the lecture, I just want to remind everybody that the final exam is coming up next week, and it will be available from the 14th to the 20th of December, and it's going to be in two parts. One is a 90-minute, quote, in-class exam. You'll have to sign up with ProctorU and get that set up ahead of time so that you can take that part of the exam. It'll be online, multiple choice, true, false, short answer, and so on. And then there will be a take-home portion that you'll be able to download starting on the 14th. It's going to involve reading a paper and answering some questions. So you can take your time with that part. So just a reminder to get signed up with ProctorU. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of adaptive management, let's just first talk about the basic premise of adaptive management and some of the things that have to be in place in order for adaptive management to really be able to move forward. First, you start off with the assertion that decisions must be made in most land management systems. So if you take the example of forestry, for example, you could argue that if you just don't log, that that's not a decision and nothing will really change. But we know now that choosing not to log an area or not to prescribe burn an area is a decision that has consequences. So in this picture on the right here, you can see an area in Northern California where I worked. It's a ponderosa pine forest, and the forester there is standing next to a nice big old ponderosa pine tree, which has been there for probably a couple hundred years. And behind him is what we call a dog hair stand of young ponderosa pine. And the reason that has gotten so dense is because this area has not burned in many decades. Ponderosa pine is adapted to fire, so when you suppress fire, it causes changes in the forest structure, one of which is these small dog hair stands. And once these get established, they can take out the entire forest, even the big trees, when a wildfire burns through, because they can create so much fuel. So I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with the fires around the West and the idea that in some cases they're more severe because of greater fuel loads. So just emphasizing that point that no decision in many cases is a decision. Also, these decisions have to be made in the face of uncertainty. We don't know what the precipitation is going to be next year, the temperatures, the wind characteristics, and so on. All of these can have an influence on decisions that you make. So it's clear that we're always making decisions in the face of uncertainty. And another basic premise is that decisions have to be made periodically. In other words, if you don't have a situation where there are periodic decisions that have to be made, adaptive management really doesn't apply. So when you make a decision to put a power plant on a river, that's pretty much a single decision. It's not like you're going to decide 2 years later, well, that wasn't a good choice. Let's pull it out and maybe we'll build one somewhere else. Well, you're talking billions of dollars in some cases. That's just not going to happen. You might tweak it a little bit, but for the most part, once that decision is made, is everything's set. But in most natural resource land management agencies, we do have often annual decisions to be made about, like, grazing intensity. How many cows do you allow in a particular grazing lot, and how long are they allowed to stay there? Do you reduce the number, increase the number, completely take them out. There's been a lot of controversy about grazing in the West recently, and a lot of pushback from different groups about the amount of grazing that's going on. The final thing that you have to have in place for um, adaptive management is you have to be monitoring the system. You have to be monitoring the resource, whether it be the vegetation, the grasses in the case of a grazing allotment, or tree size and density in the case of forestry, fish density in the case of a river or stream. You have to be monitoring the resource that you're interested in order to get feedback about how your management actions are affecting that resource. So again, if no monitoring is in place, then adaptive management simply is not possible. Um, this is an approach that's used by very many agencies, state and federal agencies in the U.S. If you're interested in getting more information about it, one of the classes in the master's degree, FW 553, Adaptive Fish and Wildlife Management, focuses on that. It's taught by Heather Jackson, who has a firm background in conservation and landscape ecology and decision analysis. So it would be a great course to get you into the real depth on this topic. So what is adaptive management? Well, the person that originated the idea is a CSU alum by the name of C.J. Walters, and he summed it up in these three words: learning by doing. And basically the idea is that we're out there on the landscape managing things all the time. So why don't we try to learn something from that management rather than just throwing away all that information? A more in-depth definition out of your textbook is this next one: an iterative process whereby management practices are initiated and effects are monitored and evaluated at regular intervals. Again, just kind of adding some more meat to the bones of the learning by doing definition. And then you have the more skeptical summary of adaptive management. By the unnamed agency biologist, making it up as you go along. And the interesting thing is that virtually every federal agency, I think a lot of state agencies, have written into their charter that they will make decisions using adaptive management. But oftentimes when it comes right down to it, they don't. And there's a number of reasons for that. Limited funding is one. So we often don't have the funding for the monitoring that we'd need to do to really monitor closely the effects of our treatments. And we all know that as different administrations come and go in the federal government, they often bring in a new crop of head people that run the agencies. They have their own agendas, and they often can switch things up right in the middle of maybe a long-term adaptive management program. So there is some skepticism out there. I think there are lots of good opportunities to use adaptive management, and hopefully most state and federal agencies will move that direction in the future. There are 5 basic steps to adaptive resource management. The first is to state the objectives very explicitly. So if you're managing for ducks, what is your real objective? Is it the total number of ducks in the population, or is it the number of ducks harvested from the population? Those two objectives will give you very different management approaches. If you're managing for a forest, are you trying to maximize the number of board feet that you can get off of that forest? Or do you have an objective of maintaining pretty view sheds without clear cuts and other sorts of things that people might view as being not so pretty? So you really have to sit down with all of the stakeholders involved and hammer out these objectives. And it can be um, difficult in some ways. This is one of the most difficult steps. You really need to think hard about what you want to try to maximize coming out the other end. Secondly, once you've identified those objectives, you identify alternative management actions, different types of harvesting trees, selective cut, clear cut. Those have different impacts on the growth rate of the trees following harvest and so on. Um, Obviously hunting, different levels of harvest, etc. Third, you want to predict the response of the system to each of the different actions that you might consider um, moving forward. And this can be done either using mathematical models or a more intuitive, a descriptive approach. So it doesn't have to get into uh, heavy math to do this sort of thing. Fourth, choose and implement an optimal decision based on the information that you have and the different alternative management actions. You choose what you think is going to get you closest to your objective, and then finally you monitor the system response with respect to the objectives and the predictions. And once you've done that, you compare your outcome to your predictions, and then you go back and start all over again. You may even change your objectives based on what you've learned. But even if your objectives stay the same, you may decide that you want to tweak your management actions based on information that you obtained. So this is very much a iterative approach that once you're done, you go back to the beginning and start over again. You might be thinking after going through the steps of adaptive management that it sounds a lot like the basic approach to the scientific method, and you would be right. A lot of people have likened adaptive management to the scientific method. In the scientific method, you make observations, develop alternative hypotheses, design an experiment, collect and analyze data, evaluate those hypotheses and how they conform to the outcome, and then go back and start over again. So in many ways, there's a lot of similarities, but there are some key differences between scientific method and adaptive management, and we'll look at those next. The principal differences between the scientific method and adaptive management comes down to four areas of uncertainty or sources of uncertainty. The first is what's known as ecological or structural uncertainty. In other words, we don't know the exact nature of the system, nor might we have good information about exactly how it responds to those management actions. So, even in forestry, there's some uncertainty about how different tree species respond to clear cutting versus selective harvest and so on. So that's kind of the level at which we're talking here, is just our ability to predict what might be the outcome of different management actions. We often use models to try to make some of these predictions, but we know that um, all models have limitations, and again, that's just going to contribute to our level of uncertainty about what the outcome of a particular management action might be. The next source of uncertainty is just environmental variation. We don't have controlled environments like a lab experiment where you can control temperature, humidity, and all these other things, and just let your system respond to the one independent variable that you're changing. And we know that from year to year, differences in rainfall and temperature can have big effects on populations that just can't be completely accounted for in our system. There's also the issue of partial controllability. basically meaning that you can't precisely control your management actions or your treatments. So if you're harvesting trees, again, you'd like to say, well, let's leave, you know, 10 trees per acre. You may or may not be able to do that depending on the contractor that's taking out the trees and the slope and the machines that you're using and so on. If you're setting fish harvest regulations, you're going to try to um, have a certain proportion of the population removed by fishermen, but you can't control, how many people are going to go out fishing. That might be a function somewhat of the weather. And so you may, um, loosen the harvest restrictions and let people take home more fish, but it's a rainy year, and so there just aren't as many fishermen out there, and so you don't achieve the level of harvest that you had hoped to from your management action. So this idea of partial controllability, it'd be like having your treatments varying in a lab experiment where you can't really put in 10 parts per million of copper into your system. You can, try, but you're going to only maybe get 6 parts per million. So that's obviously a big difference between a controlled lab experiment and a system, a real system that you can't control. And then finally is the idea of partial observability, and that is that you can't measure your response variables perfectly. So you're going to have to estimate the number of fish in the stream. After the fishing season, there's going to be variation in that. There may be certain areas you can't get to because of floods or fires or whatever. So all of these things just add to the difficulty of getting good, solid information from these management actions. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but it just means there's going to be some greater uncertainty associated with adaptive management than the standard scientific method as we think about it. Another thing to consider is when to use adaptive management. And Bill Kendall, who's here in the department, published a paper in 2001 that I think really is helpful in that it lays out situations where you would and would not use adaptive resource management. So let's come up with an example. Say you're a grouse biologist and you've noticed that nest predation on greater sage grouse nests has increased by 25% in your region, and a number of people have observed ravens preying on those nests. You also have evidence that raven numbers have increased in the area because there's been some oil and gas infrastructure that's gone in that might provide nest sites. The garbage and so on might provide food for ravens. And so there's pretty good evidence that ravens both prey on nests and that their numbers are up. So what do you do about it? Well, maybe Fish and Wildlife Service says, well, let's go out and lethally remove 100 ravens in this region over 2 years and see if that doesn't boost nesting success and get grouse back on the path to increasing populations. Well, okay, that's fine. But say a group like Audubon is also involved with this project, and they give you some pushback about the lethal removal. But before we get to that, first, both sides need to decide on management objectives. So Fish and Wildlife Service might say, well, let's try to reduce nest predation by 50%. That would really boost the grouse population and they'd be taken off like a rocket. Well, maybe Audubon says, that's expecting a lot, even from a fairly abundant predator. We think it's more likely that a 25% reduction is the most you could possibly get, and that will push lambda, or the growth rate of the population, above 1, so we'll have an increasing population. So there may be some disagreement, but again, I'm simplifying this. There's probably a lot that would go behind that discussion. If you have data on survival, on productivity, putting those together to find out how much do you need to boost nest survival in order to get the growth rate where you want it, and so on. So assuming that you can work together and come to an agreement, say reduce nest predation by 25%, then you move on to the ecological response, um, and how you achieve that objective by some management action. So as I said, Fish and Wildlife Service said, well, let's just go out and plug a bunch of these ravens, and that will reduce numbers and reduce nest predation. Audubon, being a bird group, says, these are really smart, sentient beings. We don't want to just go out there and start whacking them unless we've really, really got, that's our last alternative. How about we go out and look at the sites on the oil um, platforms where they're setting up nests, and design something to prevent them from that. Uh, put up chicken wire to keep them from getting in there, or build them in different ways such that it doesn't provide a nest platform. And we've also noticed that they're dropping down and eating garbage that builds up at some of these places, and we all know that ravens, love human food, and evidence that their numbers have increased in other areas as a result of that. And maybe they're also eating roadkill that's killed by the trucks. So Audubon comes up with an alternative and says, hey, let's educate the oil workers that are going out there, slow down the speed of the trucks so they're not killing rabbits and deer that the ravens can eat. Change how we're setting up these oil structures so that they don't have nesting platforms, and that will then lead to a reduction in raven numbers, which will result in a reduction in uh, grouse predation on their nests, and everybody will be happy. Well, there's a situation where you have two alternative management actions to achieve a certain ecological response. And that's exactly the situation where adaptive resource management can come into play. So you may say, well, we think if we can be effective by implementing this education and training program, we can reduce numbers. You might start with that first, monitor obviously raven numbers, whether there's compliance on these new regs that you've put in, and then finally sage grouse nest success. All of those things are going to help inform you about what to do next. Now, if there's a complete disagreement on what the problem is, say Audubon says, hey, there's also a lot more coyotes out there than there used to be, because again, there's all this roadkill and garbage, and they like to eat all that stuff too. And we know that coyotes are predators on sage-grouse nests. So we don't agree that ravens are the problem. We think coyotes are the problem. Well, in that situation, um, you really have to resolve, and they say, there's some other measure of management objective that we feel needs to be used in this case, maybe just growth of the sage-grouse population overall. Um, those situations are what we refer to as the conflict situations, and they have to be resolved in order to move forward with adaptive resource management. On the other hand, if everybody agrees that, yeah, ravens are a problem, and yes, lethal removal is the best way to go, then you move forward. Still, obviously, it would be helpful to monitor that, but there's no no comparison that necessarily needs to be made in that situation. So the important thing is that there are certain situations where adaptive resource management is warranted and other situations where not. That doesn't mean you shouldn't all work to try to get to that lower left-hand box, but it may take a while before you can actually get there. So we started off with a very simple example of where you have one uh, variable that you're trying to maximize, in this case, nesting success. But in many situations, you either have multiple objectives or you may have constraints. So you're having to optimize or maximize for more than one thing. Examples of multiple objectives might be maximizing diversity of, say, migrating shorebirds on a wildlife refuge through water management. So all of those species are treated equally, and you need to look at what's the combination of drawing down water in the ponds that you have out there versus maintaining ponds of a certain depth. Each migratory shorebird is going to have different preferences for water management, and so the trick there is to try to manage all of your ponds simultaneously to provide as much different habitat as possible for these species as they come through. Or another example would just be maximizing combined reproductive rates of two different species, in an area, whether it be forest or grassland um, or wetland. So again, you're going to have information about uh, both or all of those species and how they might be expected to respond to the different management actions, and then you'll have to combine those to come up with what might be the optimum for both. Another common situation is where you have constraints. So for instance, you're trying to maximize the harvest of mule deer on a army base, but you don't want to hammer them so hard that there's a chance that they could go extinct. So you want to maximize harvest while maintaining a high probability that the population will persist over time. Another example in the Pacific Northwest is on private timberlands. The company is trying to maximize timber production, but because of the listing of the northern spotted owl, many of these companies have constraints that have been put on their harvest plans by the Fish and Wildlife Service that says they have to maintain at least 20 breeding pairs or 60 breeding pairs, whatever it might be, depending on their land base. And so again, there's lots of different ways they could do that. They could just take a chunk of their property and say that's going to be our spotted owl reserve and we're never going to go in there, and cut trees, and we're just going to maintain our 20 breeding pairs. On the other hand, that may not be the best way to maximize their timber production, so they might want to go in and harvest an area where there's owls while allowing trees to grow up in another portion of their land that where owls can colonize. So again, it comes down to how much information you have about your management and how it might impact that species, how long it takes to grow a forest that an owl can use, and so on. So as an example of adaptive management or adaptive resource management, I sort of use those interchangeably. I'm going to talk about the mid-continent mallard harvest, which is covered in the paper by Johnson et al. That's assigned to you. Just a heads up, it's a very long and involved paper, has a fair amount of math and equations. Again, I'm expecting you to look at the big picture and not necessarily delve into the weeds on this. For the mid-continent mallard harvest, they basically have a objective of maximizing the long-term harvest of mallards with the constraint that they want to maintain at least 8.1 million birds in the population, in the mid-continent population. So the historic approach to setting waterfowl regulations is sort of depicted in this picture, where you'd bring together all the different states in the mid-continent region and you bring in the Fish and Wildlife Service and put them all in a room together and basically give them a couple of days to fight it out and decide who's going to get what, how many ducks are going to be able to be harvested in each state. And it would get very contentious because each state wildlife agency gets their revenue from the number of um, hunting licenses that they sell, and they're going to sell more licenses if they can harvest more ducks, if they can increase the bag limits. And so you have this inherent conflict between all of these groups. And this is a perfect situation for adaptive resource management because decisions have to be made every year. Um, and it's the Fish and Wildlife Service that brought the ARM approach to this problem. An important consideration here is to come up with a set of management alternatives, and these have to be determined at least to some extent by the managers based on feasibility and political palatability. So you can't have just some modeler that goes off and runs a model and says, well, the optimum harvest of ducks would be 4 males to 2.3 females, and so that's what our bag limit should reflect. It's going to be impossible to enforce. Hunters can't keep track of it. Even the game wardens are going to have trouble. So having people on the ground that work with the system and know what's possible and not is important. Another important consideration is that the different options should really have different costs and benefits and have pretty clearly different outcomes in terms of the system that you're managing. So if you had one bag limit of 2 ducks and another bag limit of 3 ducks, well, it's going to be really difficult to even measure the difference that those kinds of management alternatives might have. So you really want to try to come up with um, a relatively small number of very different options. Obviously not so that you're going to push your system over the edge, but you want them different enough that you could really measure a difference over a couple of years in population size or survival, whatever it might be. Um, and another consideration is that well, depending on the species, but for most vertebrates that we study, you want your management option to remain static for at least a period of a few years. So again, you have the time to really measure the effect that it might have. So in the case of ducks, there's really two things that could be managed. One is the bag limit, and in this case, they made them very, very different. So again, you could detect the difference among them. So one is closing it all, just saying, sorry, we're not going to harvest any mallards this year. They're just, numbers are low and we want to let them build up. Restrictive might be, you can only harvest 2 birds a day or something. Moderate might be 6, and a liberal would be 10 or 12. So again, you want to make these fairly different so that you can really measure an effect. And the other thing that these management agencies can change is the season length, when it starts, when it stops, and so on, which will then obviously have big impacts on how many hunter days there are, how many birds might potentially be harvested. So coming back to this idea of partial controllability that we talked about earlier and applying it to this situation, you might have your no harvest where presumably you're not going to harvest any ducks, but among the 3 other bag limits that you have, you expect to see a difference in the number of ducks harvested based on the different regulations, but there's going to be a lot of variation around that. And so under the restrictive harvest bag limit, you might on average have about 7% of the population harvested, but depending on the year and what the weather's like and how often hunters get out, that could vary a lot from, 5% to as high as 12%. Um, Under the moderate, you might expect on average about 12% harvested, and on the liberal, maybe as high as 15 or 16%. But again, there's going to be a lot of year-to-year variation here. So unlike a nice controlled experiment, your treatment effect is going to vary from year to year. So to understand the model that they used here, you have to understand the basic duck annual cycle. So we start with the breeding population. That's the box with BPOP in it on the left. And the first thing that happens to this breeding population is you have survival from the breeding season to the fall season when hunting starts. And so there might be disease, predation, birds might be flying into wires, and lots of different things that result in natural mortality in individuals before the hunting season even starts. So then that brings you to your fall adults. A is the ratio of young to adults. So that gives you um, that relationship between fall adults and fall young. They model the adults and young differently because young birds are a little stupider and they tend to get killed more often by hunters. And so you want to take that into account when you're modeling your population. K is the kill rate, so 1 minus Ka um, then would be the survival of adults through that hunting period. 1 minus Ky would be the survival of the young birds. At the end of the hunting season then would be your winter population, and then there's going to be some time between the end of that hunting season and the breeding season, and there will be some mortality. So we measure the survival from the end of the winter to breeding and denote that as SW. And then influencing the breeding population and the distribution of the birds and the recruitment rate. So A is another way of measuring recruitment, the ratio of young to adults. Is going to be influenced by the number of ponds up in the prairie pothole region, and that's influenced by exogenous factors like weather and precip. So don't really have any control over that, but it certainly has a big influence on the system. Now, one of the key issues that will influence how hunting affects the population is how the ducks survive during the hunting season. And there's basically two hypotheses of how hunting may influence survival. The first is what's known as the additive model, where it's assumed that every duck that's harvested from the population results in one less duck that makes it to the breeding season. So you take one duck out, you have one less. You take 10 ducks out, you have 10 less. The other idea that's been around for a long time and really forms the basis for a lot of hunting management is the idea of compensatory mortality. So the idea is that there's a certain proportion of the birds out there that are going to die anyway. Some of those may be in less good health, or there's simply not enough food for all of them. So initially, when you remove birds from the population, what that means is that the birds that aren't removed have more food, have more uh, ability to get into the sites with good cover and so on. And so their survival actually may increase, thereby compensating for the birds that are taken through hunting. Okay, so this is why you get this flat survivorship curve initially. That is that, even though you're taking out some birds via hunting, The ones that are left are surviving better, but that can only go so long until you finally your hunting mortality exceeds your natural mortality, and then your um, survival is going to drop as kill rate increases. But these are key to, again, understanding how hunting is going to influence that population over the long term. So we just looked at how hunting affects mortality and basically density dependent versus density independent way between um, the additive mortality where it's density independent and the compensatory mortality where it's density dependent. You can also apply that idea to recruitment. So um, if you have a weak relationship between the number of ducks that are breeding in the population and the recruitment rate, then that means that there's not as much potential for that population to bounce back, say after a bad year. So looking at these plots, A is the ratio of young to adult females in the population, usually measured in the fall. Um, and what you see on the three different lines refers to the number of ponds. Again, up there in the prairie potholes, if you have a really wet year, you're going to have 6 million ponds, say, if it's a really dry year, as low as 2 million, and that will necessarily, they've been able to measure that effect on recruitment. But then the other question becomes, what happens to the ratio of young to adults in the population as a function of the total population size? And as you might expect, as population size gets larger, more ducks crowded onto the same number of ponds, the number of young that each female can produce may go down, less food, more predators attracted, and so on. So on the left, we're just showing that as a weak relationship. On the right, we're showing it as a very, very strong relationship. So when you have a strong um, relationship between population size and recruitment, then again, that means that a population that's knocked down in one year could potentially bounce back very quickly in the next year because those females then will be cranking out a lot more young because the population's so low. So what they did then is they took these two models of effects of hunting mortality and the two models uh, associated with recruitment and put them together into four different populations models. So if we start on the top left, where you have additive hunting mortality and weak density dependence in recruitment. So again, as you hunt more ducks, you're going to have fewer at the end of the season, and you have weak density dependence, so they really can't come back well if they're knocked down by the hunting. So this top left box would be a situation where hunting has the greatest impact on the population, because as every duck removed is one less duck, and they really can't bounce back. Uh, if we move to the right, we have additive hunting mortality with strong density dependence and recruitment. So now, yes, you could knock them down in the winter, but they could come roaring back in the following year. Bottom left, compensatory hunting mortality and weak density dependent recruitment. So they could, you know, suffer some hunting without much loss in total population size, but they're not going to really bounce back very well because of the weak density dependence and recruitment. And then finally, the bottom right is a situation where the population is really pretty bomb-proof to hunting because you have compensatory hunting mortality, so it's not knocking them down that much in the winter, And if their population does drop for some reason, they can come roaring back because of that strong density dependence and recruitment. So these are the four contrasting outcomes or models that they wanted to try to identify with the long-term data. So using these models and the relationship between these various variables and the number of ponds that are out there in the prairie potholes and breeding population size, you can come up with the model-specific optimal management. And this is a little bit confusing, but if you look at that top left figure, that is that first model we discussed, where you have additive mortality in hunting and you have relatively weak density dependence of recruitment. So that was the one where we said the population is most sensitive to hunting. And counterintuitively, if you look at the y-axis, you can see at the top it's at 2, at the bottom it's 10. Not sure why they decided to go in the opposite direction here. And you can see when you have low population size, then the model says you should just close hunting and not allow any harvest of the mallards. And it's not until you get to maybe 5 or 6 million birds when you would even start thinking about allowing some harvest, and then you'd have restrictive, moderate, and you'd only have liberal harvest when you got a lot of birds and a lot of ponds. If we go down to the lower right-hand graph, this is the one where we said the population was basically bomb-proof because you have compensatory mortality and you have very strong density dependence. And again, you see here that almost under all combinations, you can just stick with the liberal hunting and go out and blast lots and lots of ducks. And only when the population size is really small would you really even drop to just a moderate bag limit. And then the other two models are somewhere in between. So what they'll do then is take these predictions and take the information that they obtain on the duck population year after year, and knowing what the harvest regulations have been previously, start to identify which one of these models best predicts how that duck population changes over time. So here we have the figure out of Johnson et al. That kind of summarizes all of the information from these different models. So if we look at the top panel, first of all, that gray band is the 95% confidence interval around the annual estimate of breeding population size of the ducks. And you see that bounces around a lot. And then each year, the biologist predicted what the outcome would be based on the input parameters from those different models. So you see in that first year, 1996, the square, which represents model with additive mortality, weak density dependence, falls almost right on top of the observed population size. Then next year, 97, basically all the models really got it wrong. The population size went way up when basically all the models predicted it would say about stable, so they kind of missed it there. The next year dropped a little bit, and the model SARS was a little bit closer. And again, as you look over this, especially as you get to these later years, if you look at the square symbol, you'll see that it often is the one that falls closest to the observed population size, especially as you get out to these later years. And what is plotted down below is the model weight. So this is the AIC weight, like you've learned about from model selection, of the weight of each of these different models over time based on their ability to predict changes in population size from one year to the next. And you see initially they're all about the same, all have about the same weight of 25%, and then boom, um, the SARW model pops up to be really the best model there in 1999, and then over time it just continues to gain more model weight until by the end in 2013, it has about 95% weight, I think is what they estimated for that. So no, it wouldn't be 95%. It's about 65% or something. Anyway, it is predicting um, the year-to-year changes in the duck population size much better than the other models. So the conclusion was that there is in fact additive mortality in the winter associated with hunting, and there's weak density dependence in recruitment. So in conclusion then, first off, adaptive resource management is not a panacea. It's not going to solve everything. As we saw, it doesn't even apply to all kinds of natural resource decisions. What it does do is it structures the decision-making process, and it focuses the discussion on the elements of this process. And so like we saw with the ducks, you need to come up with your different models. You need to come up with the estimates for the parameters of those models and so on. So it really brings everyone together to develop that, as opposed to causing friction and having stakeholders move apart. And it brings rigor to the process, just like the scientific method brings rigor to natural history. In addition, the adaptive resource management process provides for an informed decision process that can use current information in an optimal way, accounts for competing scientific views, and results in a better understanding of the system, like we saw with the ducks. That at the beginning of this, the uh, prevailing view was that hunting mortality was compensatory, and that really guided most of bag limits for duck hunting and many other species throughout the United States and really throughout the world. And so we really learned something about this system, and that the hunting mortality is really acting in an additive manner in this population, and the fact that density dependence in recruitment was rather weak, again meaning that if you overharvest the population, it's not going to be able to bounce back. So those are fundamental understandings of these populations and how they respond to this important management effect. And just to reemphasize that adaptive resource management intersects with, but is not equivalent to, experimentation. And so this is the end of our last lecture. Just a reminder to make sure you're signed up for ProctorU for the first part of the final exam. And just want to say I've enjoyed teaching the class. I've learned a lot from the discussion posts that you've put up, and I've really been impressed by the information that all of you provided, and the depth that you've understood the different readings. I've thrown a lot at you, but it's pretty clear that most of you are really getting the ideas that I was hoping you were getting. So thank you for working so hard in the class, and dib, 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 dib. That's all, folks.